I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. 3 years. 3 long years since I'd seen this place, since I'd hugged my parents, since I'd felt like I belonged somewhere. The autumn leaves crunched under my tires as I parked next to the old oak tree where Jake and I used to build forts. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked up the familiar stone pathway, carrying a bouquet of Mom's favorite chrysanthemums and a bottle of Dad's preferred wine. This was supposed to be our reconciliation, our fresh start. I rang the doorbell expecting warm embraces and maybe some tears of joy. Instead, the door swung open to reveal my father's face, cold as winter stone. His eyes looked right through me like I was a stranger. "We don't have a daughter," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Please leave." Behind him, my brother Jake appeared wearing the keys to my old bedroom on his keychain, a satisfied smirk playing across his lips. The flowers slipped from my numb fingers, scattering across the welcome mat that suddenly felt anything but welcoming. My mind raced backward 3 years to the last time I'd stood on this porch. I'd been 25 then, fresh out of graduate school with a computer science degree and burning ambition to start my own tech company. Dad had other plans. He wanted me to marry Thomas Brennan, the son of his business partner, a man twice my age who collected vintage cars and spoke to me like I was one of his possessions waiting to be acquired. "Marriage will give you stability." Victoria, Dad, had insisted using my full name the way he did when he meant business. "Thomas can provide for you. This computer nonsense is just a phase." I'd refused. Not just politely declined, but stood my ground with the fierce determination that had carried me through years of being the only woman in most of my engineering classes. "I'm going to build something that matters," I'd told him. "I'm going to change how small businesses operate, make technology accessible to everyone." Jake had been there that night too, 26 years old, and still living at home working sporadically for Dad's construction company when he felt like it. He'd laughed at my dreams, called them foolish fantasies of a girl who didn't understand how the real world worked. "You'll be back," he'd said with that same smirk I was seeing now. "When you're broke and desperate, you'll come crawling back begging for Thomas Brennan and his money." But I hadn't come crawling back. Instead, I'd packed everything I owned into my Honda Civic and driven west to California with $800 and a business plan I'd written on the back of napkins. The first year had been brutal. I'd lived in my car for 3 months, showering at truck stops and coding in coffee shops until they kicked me out. I'd survived on ramen noodles and determination, building my inventory management app one line of code at a time. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me back to the present moment. The caller ID showed my banker's direct line. Perfect timing. "Mr. Patterson," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside my chest. "It's Vicky Chen. I need you to proceed with the foreclosure proceedings on the Maple Street property. Yes, the one we discussed last month. Execute it immediately." I watched Dad's face change as the words sank in. His confident dismissal flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. The color drained from Dad's weathered face as he processed what he'd just heard. Jake's cocky expression faltered for just a moment before he recovered, stepping protectively in front of our father. What are you talking about, Vicky?" Jake demanded, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "You've been gone for 3 years. You don't know anything about our business." I almost laughed at the irony. If only he knew how much I'd been watching, how carefully I'd been monitoring every aspect of their lives from 2,000 miles away. My success hadn't been built on luck or connections. It had been built on information, on understanding systems, and finding the weaknesses that others overlooked. My app inventory flow had revolutionized how small businesses track their supplies and manage their operations. What had started as a simple program I'd coded in coffee shops had grown into a platform used by over 50,000 companies across North America. By my 26th birthday, I was pulling in 7 figures annually. By 27, I'd been featured on the cover of Tech Entrepreneur magazine as one of the 30 under 30 changing American business. But success hadn't made me forget where I'd come from or the people who'd rejected me when I'd needed them most. I'd hired a private investigator 18 months ago, not out of spite, but out of concern. Despite everything that had happened, these were still my parents, and I'd wanted to make sure they were okay. What Franklin investigations had uncovered had broken my heart in ways I hadn't expected. Dad's construction company, Morrison Family Building, was hemorrhaging money. 3 major projects had gone over budget due to poor planning and cost overruns. 2 clients had sued for breach of contract when deadlines weren't met. The company that had once employed 23 people now struggled to keep 8 on payroll. But the most devastating revelation had been Jake's involvement in the financial decline. My brother, who'd always been quick to spend money but slow to earn it, had convinced Dad to invest their emergency fund in a series of get-rich-quick schemes. Cryptocurrency investments timed perfectly wrong, rental properties in declining neighborhoods, a failed attempt to flip houses that had left them underwater on 3 mortgages. "I've been helping your business stay afloat for the past 18 months. I told them, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside my chest. Morrison Family Building has been receiving contracts from Pacific Coast Development Group. Installation jobs, renovation projects, emergency repairs. Every single one of those contracts came through my shell company." Dad's face went from pale to gray. "That's impossible. We've never worked for any company with connections to you." I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the email thread I'd saved for this moment. Pacific Coast Development Group, subsidiary of Western Innovation Holdings, which is owned by Chen Tech Solutions. "I've been funneling legitimate work to you through 3 layers of corporate structure, paying premium rates to keep your company from going bankrupt." Jake's hands were shaking now. "Why would you do that?" "We disowned you. We told you never to come back." The truth was complicated, painted in shades of love and hurt that I wasn't sure I fully understood myself. Despite their rejection, despite the way they'd chosen societal expectations over my dreams, they were still my family. I'd succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, but success felt hollow when you had no one to share it with. "Because I hoped that someday we could fix this," I said. "I hoped that when you saw I'd built something real, something valuable, you might realize you'd been wrong about me." "But there's something else you need to know," I continued, my voice hardening. 6 months ago, I purchased the mortgage on this house from Midwest Savings and Loan. They were preparing to foreclose because you'd missed 4 payments. I bought the debt to protect you, to give you time to get back on your feet." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. In the distance, I could hear Mrs. Patterson raking leaves in her yard, the normal sounds of a neighborhood preparing for winter. But nothing about this moment felt normal. My private investigator had uncovered something else, something that had made me realize this confrontation was inevitable. Jake hadn't just been bad with money. He'd been actively working against me, poisoning my parents' opinion of me, making sure the separation remained permanent. The foreclosure wasn't just a business decision. It was the beginning of a much larger revelation that would change everything any of us thought we knew about family loyalty and the price of betrayal. Jake stepped off the porch, moving closer to me, with an aggressive swagger that reminded me of the playground bullies from elementary school. But we weren't children anymore, and the stakes were much higher than hurt feelings and scraped knees. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he said, his voice low and venomous. "Coming back here with your money and your threats, trying to make us feel guilty for choosing dignity over your selfishness." Selfishness. The word hit me like a physical blow. I was selfish for wanting to build my own life, instead of marrying a man I didn't love. "You were selfish for abandoning your family when we needed you most." Jake's mask was slipping now, revealing something ugly underneath. "Do you know what happened after you left? Dad's health started failing because he was worried sick about you. Mom cried herself to sleep for months, wondering if you were safe, if you were eating, if you were even alive. Each word was carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, but I'd learned to recognize manipulation tactics from my years in the tech industry. Venture capitalists and competitors had tried to break me down with similar psychological warfare. The difference was that this time, the attacks were coming from someone who was supposed to love me. If they were so worried, why did they refuse every attempt I made to contact them? I asked. I sent letters, emails, tried calling. Every single attempt was ignored or returned unopened. Jake's laugh was cold and bitter. Because we knew you'd tried to manipulate them just like you're doing right now. You'd promised to change, to give up this ridiculous business fantasy, and then you'd disappoint them all over again when you couldn't follow through. Business fantasy. I pulled out my phone and showed him the Forbes article featuring my company. This fantasy employs 237 people and generated $48 million in revenue last year. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, not admiration or pride, but something darker, envy mixed with genuine hatred. None of that matters, he said, stepping even closer. You chose money over family. You chose your precious career over the people who raised you and loved you. The people who loved me wouldn't have demanded I give up my dreams to make them happy. Dreams. Jake's voice rose to almost a shout. You mean your selfish need to prove you're better than everyone else, your pathetic attempt to show up all the men in your life. The accusation hung in the air between us, and suddenly I understood something that had been nagging at me since I'd arrived. This wasn't about family honor or traditional values or even concern for my well-being. This was about Jake feeling threatened by my success, diminished by my achievements. This has never been about what's best for our parents, has it? I said quietly. This is about you being jealous that the sister you dismissed as naive and foolish became more successful than you ever imagined possible. Jake's face twisted with rage. Successful. You want to know what success looks like? I'll show you what success looks like. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased from being handled repeatedly. With shaking hands, he unfolded it and held it up for me to see. It was a letter written in my handwriting dated 3 years and 2 months ago, but as I read the words, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Dear family. The letter began, I've realized that I made a terrible mistake trying to pursue this business venture. I failed completely, lost everything, and I'm too ashamed to face you. I've decided that the world would be better off without someone like me in it. Please don't try to find me. By the time you read this, I'll be gone forever. I love you, but I can't bear to disappoint you anymore. Victoria. Where did you get that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jake's smile was triumphant and cruel. I wrote it myself. Amazing how well I remember your handwriting from all those years of forging your signature on permission slips and report cards when you were too busy with your computer classes to handle your own responsibilities. The implications crashed over me like a tidal wave. You sent this to our parents. I sent copies to everyone who mattered. Mom, Dad, your old teachers, even some of your college friends. As far as anyone in this town knows, Vicki Morrison committed suicide 3 years ago because she couldn't handle being a failure. My legs felt weak. I had to grab onto the porch railing to keep from falling. They think I'm dead. They held a memorial service and everything. Very touching. Mom planted a rose bush in the backyard in your memory. Dad donated your old computer equipment to the high school. We've all moved on from the tragedy of losing you to your own pride and stubbornness. The cruelty was breathtaking in its completeness. Not only had Jake cut me off from my family, he'd made sure that any attempt I made to reconnect would be seen as either impossible or deeply disturbing. But here's the thing, dear sister. Jake continued, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. If you try to expose any of this, if you try to convince them that their dead daughter has somehow returned from the grave, I'll make sure they suffer in ways you can't imagine. Mom's not as strong as she used to be, and stress affects her heart condition. Dad's blood pressure medication keeps him stable, but emotional trauma could easily trigger something fatal. He leaned closer, and I could smell alcohol on his breath despite the early hour. So here's what's gonna happen. You're going to get back in your fancy car drive back to whatever expensive city you came from and pretend this conversation never happened. Because if you don't, if you try to resurrect yourself and destroy the peace our family has finally found, you'll be responsible for whatever happens to them. The threat was clear, and the worst part was that I could see he meant every word. This wasn't just manipulation or psychological warfare. This was a man who would genuinely hurt innocent people to protect his version of reality. But Jake had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that the scared, uncertain girl who'd left 3 years ago was the same person standing in front of him now. He had no idea what I'd learned about fighting back against bullies or how many times I'd been underestimated and had turned that underestimation into a strategic advantage. I'd built my business by finding solutions to problems that others thought were unsolvable, and Jake Morrison had just become a problem that needed solving. I walked around the side of the house, my heart pounding as I processed everything Jake had just revealed. The familiar path to the back garden felt different, now tainted by the knowledge of the lies that had been built on my supposed death. The rose bush he'd mentioned stood near Mom's old herb garden. Its late-season blooms a deep red that reminded me uncomfortably of blood. But something was wrong with the house itself. The upstairs bedroom window that had been Mom and Dad's room for 30 years was covered with heavy curtains, and I could see what looked like a small lock mechanism attached to the outside of the window frame. The house felt too quiet, like a held breath. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos my private investigator had taken over the past 18 months. Franklin had been thorough documenting the family's routines, their financial transactions, and their social interactions. But looking at the images now with fresh eyes, I began to notice patterns that hadn't seemed significant before. Mom was rarely photographed outside the house. When she was visible in windows, she often appeared confused or distressed. Dad seemed to be gone most days, leaving early and returning late, while Jake's car was almost always in the driveway. The dynamic looked less like a family living together and more like a prisoner being guarded. I circled back toward the front of the house, staying close to the exterior walls to avoid being seen from the windows. As I passed under the kitchen window, I heard voices from inside, muffled but urgent. "Did you give her the morning pills?" Jake's voice was sharp, impatient. "I gave her what you told me to give her," Dad replied, but he sounded uncertain, worried. "But Jake, I'm starting to think maybe we should talk to Dr. Peterson again. Her confusion is getting worse, and some of the things she says about Vicky." "Dad, we've been through this 100 times. The grief is making her hallucinate. Dr. Peterson explained that some elderly people create fantasy scenarios to cope with loss. The medication is helping her stay calm and preventing her from getting agitated about things that aren't real." "But what if... What if... What?" Jake's voice turned cold. "What if our dead daughter magically came back to life? What if the suicide note was fake? What if everything we've believed for 3 years is suddenly wrong?" There was a long pause, and I pressed myself closer to the wall, straining to hear. The nursing home called yesterday," Dad said quietly. "Sunset Manor has an opening. They said with her condition progressing, it might be time to consider full-time care." "That's probably for the best," Jake replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "She'll be safer there with professional staff who understand how to handle patients with dementia. And it'll be easier on you not having to worry about her wandering off or getting confused and trying to call people who aren't there anymore." Dementia. The word hit me like a physical blow. My mother, who had been sharp as a tack when I'd left, who had balanced the family budget, and organized community fundraisers and never forgot a birthday or anniversary, was supposedly suffering from dementia severe enough to require institutional care. But the timing was too convenient, the onset too sudden, and Jake's eagerness to have her move to a facility where she'd be isolated from anyone who might listen to her stories about her supposedly dead daughter raised red flags that I couldn't ignore. I waited until I heard footsteps moving toward the front of the house, then carefully tested the back door. It was unlocked, probably because Jake felt secure in his control over the situation. I slipped inside, moving as quietly as possible through the kitchen that had been the heart of my childhood. Everything looked the same, but felt different. The refrigerator was covered with prescription reminder charts and medication schedules. The counter was cluttered with pill bottles, more than seemed necessary for two elderly people. I photographed the labels, quickly noting dosages and prescribing physicians. The stairs creaked in the same places they always had, a fact that both comforted and terrified me as I made my way to the second floor. Mom and Dad's bedroom door was closed, and I could hear the soft sound of television playing inside. I knocked gently. "Mom, it's me." The television went silent immediately. "Mom!" I tried again, turning the doorknob. It was locked from the outside. My hands shook as I examined the mechanism. It was a simple sliding bolt lock, the kind you might use to secure a shed or garage, completely inappropriate for an interior bedroom door. This wasn't about safety or medical care. This was imprisonment. I slid the bolt open and pushed the door gently inward. The woman sitting on the edge of the bed looked like my mother, but aged far beyond the 3 years that had passed. Her hair, once carefully styled and colored, hung limp and gray around her shoulders. She wore a faded nightgown despite the late morning hour, and her eyes held a confusion that broke my heart. But when those eyes focused on my face, recognition flickered like a candle flame in a dark room. "Vicky." Her voice was barely a whisper, as if she was afraid that speaking my name too loudly would make me disappear. "Oh my God, Vicky, is that really you?" I crossed the room in 3 quick steps and knelt beside the bed, taking her hands in mine. They were thin and cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "It's me, Mom. It's really me." Tears streamed down her face as she pulled me into a hug that felt like coming home and breaking apart at the same time. "They told me you were dead," she sobbed. "They said you killed yourself because your business failed and you were ashamed. But I never believed it. I kept telling them it wasn't true, that you wouldn't do that, that something was wrong with their story." "I'm alive, Mom. I'm okay. My business didn't fail. I'm successful, I'm healthy, and I've been trying to get in touch with you for 3 years. She pulled back to look at my face, her hands framing my cheeks like she used to do when I was a child. Jake said I was imagining things. He said the grief was making me confused, making me see things that weren't real. Dr. Peterson prescribed medication to help with the hallucinations. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. "Mom, have you been taking medication that you didn't take before I left?" She nodded, pointing to a small table beside the bed, covered with pill bottles. "Jake brings them every morning and evening. He says they're for my heart condition and my blood pressure, but I don't remember having those problems before. And they make me feel strange, like my thoughts are wrapped in cotton." I examined the bottles, photographing each label. Several of the medications were antipsychotics and sedatives, drugs that would cause exactly the kind of confusion and memory problems that Jake was attributing to dementia. Mixed together in the dosages prescribed, they would make anyone appear mentally unstable. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything. What really happened after I left? What did Jake tell you about me?" Her story came out in fragments, interrupted by moments of clarity and confusion that I realized were probably the result of medication wearing off between doses. Jake had presented the suicide note 2 weeks after I'd actually left, claiming he'd found it in my old bedroom. He'd organized a memorial service before anyone could ask too many questions, and had gradually taken over more and more of the household responsibilities. as Mom struggled to process her grief. The supposed heart condition and dementia diagnosis had begun about 18 months ago, coinciding with increased medication and decreased contact with friends and neighbors. Jake had convinced Dad that Mom needed to be protected from stress and confusion, which meant limiting her social interactions and keeping her isolated from situations that might trigger painful memories. "But Vicky," she said, gripping my hands tighter, "there's something else you need to know, something Jake doesn't realize I remember." She stood on unsteady legs and walked to her dresser, moving aside some folded clothes to reveal a small wooden box hidden underneath. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and a collection of papers that made my blood run cold as I read through them. Jake had been forging Dad's signature on financial documents for over 2 years. He'd transferred the house deed into his own name, claiming it was for estate planning purposes. He'd emptied Mom and Dad's retirement accounts, supposedly to invest in higher yield opportunities that never seemed to materialize. Most damaging of all, he'd filled out preliminary paperwork to have both parents declared mentally incompetent, listing himself as their legal guardian. "I found these in his room when he was out one day," Mom explained. "I may be confused sometimes, but I'm not stupid. I know what he's planning to do to us." The final document in the box was a life insurance policy amendment recently filed that would pay out the maximum benefit if both parents died in an accident or from natural causes related to their supposed medical conditions. Jake wasn't just stealing from them. He was planning to get rid of them entirely. And with me officially dead, there would be no one left to question his inheritance of the family assets or to challenge his version of events. But Jake had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd underestimated the love between a mother and daughter, and he'd forgotten that some bonds are strong enough to survive even the most elaborate lies. I was very much alive, and I was about to make sure everyone knew it. The sound of footsteps on the stairs sent both Mom and me into immediate panic mode. I helped her quickly hide the documents back in the wooden box and slip it under the dresser clothes, while she climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. "Remember," I whispered urgently, "act confused. Don't let him know we talked about anything important." The bedroom door burst open without a knock, and Dad filled the doorway. His face flushed red with anger and what looked like genuine fear. Behind him, Jake hovered like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. "What the hell are you doing in here?" Dad demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "I told you to leave. This is my house, and you're trespassing." I stood slowly, keeping my hands visible and my voice calm. I wanted to see Mom. "It's been 3 years, Dad. 3 years since I've seen either of you." "You have no right," he said, stepping into the room with his fists clenched. "Your mother is sick. She doesn't need to be confused by someone pretending to be her dead daughter." The word pretending hit me like a slap. "Dad, it's me. It's really me. I'm not dead. I never tried to hurt myself. Everything Jake told you was a lie." "Lies." Dad's laugh was bitter and broken. "You want to talk about lies? Let me tell you about lies, young lady. Lies are when a daughter abandons her family and then sends fake suicide notes to manipulate people into feeling sorry for her." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Fake suicide notes, Dad. I never sent any suicide note. I've never even considered hurting myself." "Don't." His voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare stand in my house and try to gaslight me about something I lived through. Do you have any idea what it was like to get that letter? Do you know what it did to your mother to believe her only daughter had killed herself because we weren't supportive enough?" Jake stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. It was different from the one he'd shown me outside, written on different stationery in slightly different handwriting. But it was still supposedly from me, still describing failure and shame and a desire to escape from disappointment. "We received 3 different notes over 6 months. Jake explained, his voice carefully modulated to sound concerned and protective. "The first one talked about business failures. The second mentioned feeling abandoned by family. The third was her final goodbye. I stared at the papers, my mind racing. Jake hadn't just forged one suicide note, he'd created an entire psychological profile of a disturbed young woman, gradually spiraling towards self-destruction. Each note built on the previous one, creating a narrative that would be almost impossible to dispute after the fact. "Dad," I said, reaching into my purse to pull out my business license and tax returns, "look at these documents. Look at my company registration, my bank statements. I never failed. I never went bankrupt. My business has been successful beyond anything I dreamed when I left here." Dad barely glanced at the papers before pushing them away. Anyone can forge financial documents these days. The internet makes it easy to create fake identities, fake businesses, fake lives. "Then call the Better Business Bureau. Contact the California Secretary of State. Verify my business registration independently." "I'm not playing these games with someone who's clearly mentally unstable," Dad said, but I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. "Jake, call the police. Tell them we have an intruder who's harassing an elderly woman with dementia." "Dad, please." I tried one more time, my voice breaking. "Just listen to me for 5 minutes. Let me prove who I am." That's when I pulled out my phone and showed him the photo I'd taken with the President's Council on Women Entrepreneurs 6 months earlier. It was an official White House photograph with my name clearly listed in the caption as the founder and CEO of Chen Tech Solutions. Dad stared at the screen for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been fear. "This could be photoshopped," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad," I said gently, "what was the name of the stuffed rabbit I carried everywhere until I was 8 years old?" "Anyone could know that," he replied, but he was wavering. "What song did you sing to me when I had nightmares about monsters in my closet?" His mouth opened, then closed without sound. "So, what did I say to you the night before I left for college when we were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset?" Dad's face went pale and his hand reached out to steady himself against the doorframe. You said you hoped you'd make me proud someday." "And what did you say back?" "I said you already made me proud every day just by being my daughter." His voice was barely a whisper now. "But that doesn't prove anything. Jake could have told you about those conversations." I could see the internal war playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to believe I was real, that his daughter was alive and successful and standing in front of him. But 3 years of conditioning, of believing I was dead, of being told that any evidence to the contrary was fake or manipulated, had created psychological barriers that wouldn't be easily overcome. That's when Jake made his critical error. "Dad, don't let her manipulate you," he said, his voice sharp with impatience. "This is exactly what the grief counselor warned us about. Some people prey on families who've lost children using personal information to create elaborate cons." But as Jake stepped closer to assert control over the situation, the stress of maintaining his multiple layers of deception while improvising responses to my unexpected return finally overwhelmed his system. Dad clutched his chest, his face turning gray as pain shot down his left arm. I can't breathe," he gasped, stumbling backward against the wall. "Dad!" I lunged forward to catch him as his knees buckled, but Jake was faster, positioning himself between us. "Don't touch him," Jake snapped. "You've caused enough damage already." But as Dad collapsed to the floor, his breathing shallow and labored, I saw something flicker across Jake's face that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't panic or concern for our father's well-being. It was calculation. "Call 911, I screamed, dropping to my knees beside Dad and checking his pulse. "I'm calling," Jake said, but he moved slowly, deliberately, as if he was in no hurry to summon help. And in that moment, watching my brother's reaction to our father's medical emergency, I realized that this wasn't just about inheritance or family control. Jake was waiting for Dad to die. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but it felt like hours as I performed CPR on Dad's still form, while Jake made a show of pacing anxiously nearby. The EMTs worked with professional efficiency, stabilizing his heartbeat and getting him loaded into the ambulance for transport to Mercy General Hospital. I rode in my own car, following the flashing lights through familiar streets that looked different through a veil of fear and adrenaline. Jake drove separately, which gave me a few precious minutes to call my attorney in California and explain the situation. Get me everything you can on Jake Morrison. I told Rebecca Martinez, my legal counsel, who'd helped me navigate everything from business contracts to trademark disputes, financial records, criminal background, employment history, medical records if possible, and I need it within 24 hours. Viggy, are you in some kind of danger? I don't know yet, but something is very wrong here and I need ammunition if this situation escalates. At the hospital, Dad was rushed into the cardiac care unit while Jake and I were relegated to a sterile waiting room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. He sat across from me, no longer bothering to maintain the facade of brotherly concern now that we were alone. "This is your fault," he said quietly. "The stress of seeing you, of having his dead daughter show up and challenge everything he believed about reality triggered this attack." The stress of discovering he'd been lied to for 3 years, you mean? Jake's smile was cold and calculating. Who's going to believe that a daughter who abandoned her family, supposedly committed suicide, and then mysteriously returned from the dead with wild stories about forged documents and elaborate deceptions, or a son who's been caring for his aging parents through a family tragedy? I was about to respond when my phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but the content made my blood freeze. "Your father's heart condition is unfortunately quite serious. It would be a shame if complications arose during his recovery. Perhaps it's time to reconsider your decision to disrupt this family's healing process." I looked up at Jake, who was scrolling through his own phone with deliberate casualness. "Did you just threaten our father's life?" I asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied without looking up. "I'm just checking with his insurance company about coverage for his treatment. Did you know that patients with pre-existing conditions can have very unpredictable outcomes, especially when they're dealing with emotional trauma?" The threat was clear, even if it was couched in seemingly innocent language. Jake was letting me know that he had ways to influence Dad's medical care and that my continued presence could have fatal consequences. But what Jake didn't realize was that I'd been recording our conversation on my phone since we'd arrived at the hospital. Every threat, every implied admission of guilt was now documented and stored in cloud backup systems that he couldn't access or delete. Dr. Sarah Chen entered the waiting room an hour later, looking exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "Mr. Morrison is stable," she announced. "It was a mild heart attack, but we caught it early enough to prevent major damage. However, there are some concerning aspects of his condition that I need to discuss with his family." "What kind of concerns?" Jake asked, his voice carefully modulated to sound worried rather than hopeful. "His blood work shows elevated levels of several compounds that shouldn't be present in therapeutic doses," Dr. Chen explained. "Some of these substances can cause anxiety, paranoia, and elevated blood pressure over time. We are running additional toxicology tests to determine the source." I felt my pulse quicken. "What kinds of substances?" "Primarily anxiolytic medications and mild hallucinogens, nothing immediately life-threatening but concerning when found in someone who isn't prescribed these medications. The levels suggest ongoing exposure rather than a single incident." Jake's face remained carefully neutral, but I could see tension building in his shoulders. Could these substances cause confusion or memory problems? Absolutely. Long-term exposure to these compounds could mimic symptoms of dementia or other cognitive disorders, especially in elderly patients. "Doctor," I said, "is it possible that someone has been deliberately administering these substances without his knowledge?" Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. That's certainly something we need to consider. If Mr. Morrison has been the victim of medication abuse, it would constitute a serious crime and would require immediate investigation. Now, wait just a minute, Jake interjected. Are you suggesting that someone in our family has been poisoning him? That's a very serious accusation to make without evidence. I'm not making accusations, Dr. Chen replied calmly. I'm stating medical facts. Your father has been exposed to substances that could cause significant health problems, and we need to determine the source to prevent further exposure. That's when Nurse Patricia Williams entered the waiting room, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that immediately put me on alert. "Excuse me," she said, "but I need to speak with someone about Jake Morrison." "That's me," Jake replied, standing up with a confident smile. "Sir, we've been reviewing your father's medical records, and there are some questions about medications that have been filled in your name over the past 18 months. The pharmacy flagged several prescriptions that don't match standard protocols for the conditions listed." Jake's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "I don't understand. What prescriptions?" Nurse Williams consulted her clipboard. "Prescriptions for antipsychotic medications, sedatives, and anxiety medications, all written by different doctors across 3 different medical groups. The quantities and combinations are concerning, especially since none of these doctors have any record of treating conditions that would require these specific medications." My heart started racing as the implications became clear. "Are you saying that Jake has been obtaining prescription medications fraudulently?" "We're saying that there are irregularities that require investigation," Nurse Williams replied diplomatically. "Hospital security has been notified, and they'll be conducting interviews with all family members to clarify the situation." But Jake was already moving backing toward the exit with his phone in his hand. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and be accused of crimes by people who don't understand our family's medical situation." "Sir, please don't leave," Nurse Williams called out. "We need to complete our investigation." "Investigate whatever you want," Jake replied, his mask finally slipping completely. "But I know my rights, and I don't have to subject myself to harassment based on medical records that could have been altered or misinterpreted." He was at the door now, and I could see him scrolling through his phone contacts, probably looking for the number of a lawyer or someone else who could help him navigate this rapidly deteriorating situation. That's when Nurse Williams dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "Mr. Jake Morrison, you need to be aware that your photograph matches a person of interest in an ongoing investigation by the FBI into prescription drug theft and elder abuse. Hospital security has been instructed to detain you for questioning." Jake's face went white, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "You have the wrong person," he said, but his voice was shaking now. "This is a case of mistaken identity." 2 security guards appeared at the waiting room entrance, blocking his escape route. And that's when I realized that the web of lies Jake had constructed around my family was much larger and more dangerous than any of us had imagined. Hospital security detained Jake in a small conference room while the FBI was contacted, but I could tell from the whispered conversations between staff members that there was much more to this story than I'd initially understood. Nurse Williams approached me after Jake had been escorted away, her expression a mixture of professional concern and genuine sympathy. "Ms. Morrison, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your family situation," she said, settling into the chair next to me in the now empty waiting room. "But first, I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We've seen similar patterns before." Similar patterns. Elder abuse cases involving adult children who isolate their parents from support systems, manipulate their medications, and systematically steal their assets. Your brother's case matches a profile we've been tracking across multiple states. I felt a chill run down my spine. How many cases? At least 12 that we know of, possibly more. The FBI has been building a case against an organized network that targets elderly people with adult children who have gambling problems, drug addictions, or other financial pressures. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Jake's gambling problem, his apparent access to prescription medications from multiple sources, his systematic isolation of our parents from their social support network. This wasn't just family dysfunction or even simple greed, this was organized crime. Ms. Morrison, Nurse Williams continued, I've been working with a social worker who specializes in elder abuse cases. Her name is Susan Clark, and she's helped dozens of families navigate situations similar to yours. Would you be willing to speak with her? Susan Clark turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of calm competence that comes from years of dealing with crisis situations. She arrived at the hospital within an hour and immediately set about creating a safe space for our conversation. First thing you need to know, she said, settling into her chair with a thick folder of documents, is that what you've described is not uncommon. Adult children who systematically abuse elderly parents often use very similar tactics, including forged documents, medication manipulation, and isolation from potential allies. But the suicide notes, the fake memorial service, the elaborate deception about my death, that seems extreme even for this type of situation. Susan nodded grimly. Actually, that's more common than you might think. Abusers often work to eliminate potential threats to their control, and adult children who live independently or have outside resources represent a significant threat. By convincing your parents that you were dead, your brother eliminated any possibility that you might interfere with his plans. She's opened her folder and pulled out a series of photographs and documents. These are from similar cases we've worked on. Notice the patterns. Adult children who gradually take control of household finances, elderly parents who become increasingly isolated from friends and community, suspicious medical diagnoses that justify increased supervision and medication. The parallels to my family's situation were unmistakable and deeply disturbing. The good news, Susan continued, is that we've developed effective strategies for addressing these situations. The bad news is that your brother's case appears to be part of a larger criminal organization, which means the stakes are higher and the risks more serious. What kind of organization? We believe there's a network of individuals who target vulnerable elderly people, often working with corrupt medical professionals, lawyers, and financial advisors to systematically drain assets while maintaining the appearance of legitimate caregiving. Susan pulled out another document, this one bearing the FBI logo. Agent Maria Santos has been investigating this network for over 2 years. She's identified at least 40 victims across 8 states with total financial losses exceeding $12 million. Well, $12 million. The operation is sophisticated and well organized. They identify elderly targets with significant assets, place someone close to them, usually a family member or caregiver, and then systematically isolate the victims while transferring assets to accounts controlled by the network. My phone buzzed with a text from my attorney. Preliminary background check on Jake Morrison complete. Multiple red flags. Call immediately. I excused myself to make the call, stepping into the hospital hallway, where Rebecca Martinez's voice came through clear and urgent. Vicky, your brother is in serious trouble. I've found evidence linking him to at least 6 different elderly abuse cases across California, Arizona, and New Mexico. Credit card fraud, identity theft, prescription drug trafficking, and possibly worse. 3 of the elderly victims died under suspicious circumstances after transferring significant assets to accounts controlled by people matching your brother's profile. The authorities are investigating potential murder charges. The hallway seemed to spin around me as the full implications hit home. Jake hadn't just been stealing from our parents. He'd been part of a criminal organization that was literally killing elderly people for their money. Rebecca, I need you to contact the FBI immediately. There's an agent, Maria Santos, investigating this network. Tell her that I have evidence linking Jake to current ongoing abuse of elderly victims. When I returned to Susan's conference room, she was on her own phone, speaking in the clipped professional tones of someone coordinating an emergency response. Agent Santos is en route, she informed me after ending her call. She'll be here within 2 hours. In the meantime, we need to discuss protective measures for your parents. Protective measures. If your brother is part of this criminal network, and if they believe your parents pose a threat to their operation, there could be attempts to silence them permanently. We've seen cases where victims who started recovering their mental clarity or talking about their abuse were found dead within days. The thought of losing my parents just as I'd found them again was unbearable. What can we do? First, we move them to a secure location where the network can't access them. Second, we document everything they remember about the abuse while their minds are still clear. Third, we prepare for the possibility that this case will require witness protection if the criminal charges are as serious as we suspect. Susan's phone rang again, and I could hear urgency in the caller's voice even though I couldn't make out the words. That was Dr. Chen, Susan said after hanging up. Your father is asking for you, and there's something he needs to tell you immediately. Something he says he should have realized months ago. As we hurried back toward the cardiac unit, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family's situation was about to change again. And this time, the revelation would put all of our lives in immediate danger. Dad was sitting up in his hospital bed when we arrived, looking more alert and focused than I'd seen him since my arrival. The IV drip that was clearing the toxins from his system had also cleared the fog from his mind, and the man looking back at me was recognizably my father for the first time in 3 years. Vicky, he said, his voice stronger, but heavy with remorse. I need to tell you something that I should have figured out months ago. I took his hand, noting that his grip was steady and warm. What is it, Dad? Jake has been drugging me. Not just making me confused, but making me paranoid and suspicious of everyone except him. About 6 months ago, I started having doubts about your death. Small things that didn't add up. But every time I tried to think clearly about them, I'd have these episodes of anxiety and confusion. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a small plastic bag containing several pills of different colors and sizes. I started pretending to take my morning medication and hiding the pills instead. When my head cleared enough to think straight, I began to realize that none of the doctors Jake claimed to be taking me to see actually existed. The prescriptions were coming from pharmacies in different cities, and the names on the bottles didn't match any physicians in our insurance network. Susan examined the pills, photographing each one with her phone. Mr. Morrison, how long have you been collecting these? 3 weeks. Once I started thinking clearly, I also began to remember things. Phone calls Jake made when he thought I was asleep. Conversations with people about moving the timeline forward and liquidating assets before the window closed. Dad's voice dropped to a whisper. He's not working alone, Vicky. There are other people involved, and they've been pressuring him to resolve our situation permanently. What do you mean by permanently? I overheard him talking to someone about staging an accident. Car crash, house fire, something that would look natural, but would eliminate the possibility of us recovering our mental clarity and exposing what he's been doing. Susan and I exchanged glances. Dad, did you hear any names? Any specific details about these other people? Some. There's someone called Marcus who seems to be in charge. A woman named Diana who handles the financial side, and someone they refer to as Doc, who provides medical cover stories and prescription access. Dad pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pajama pocket. I wrote down everything I could remember, including phone numbers Jake called and dates when strange people visited the house while you were gone. The list was extensive and detailed the product of a sharp mind that had been systematically suppressed, but was now fighting back. Names, dates, descriptions of individuals who had visited the house claiming to be medical professionals or financial advisors, license plate numbers of unfamiliar cars, overheard fragments of conversations about other families in other states. Mr. Morrison, Susan said gently, this information could help the FBI save other families from going through what you've experienced. But it also means that you and your wife are in immediate danger if this criminal organization realizes you've regained your mental clarity. I know, Dad replied. That's why I asked for Vicky. If something happens to us, I need her to know that we never stopped loving her, that we were manipulated into believing things that weren't true. Tears started flowing down my cheeks as 3 years of hurt and confusion began to resolve into understanding and forgiveness. Dad, nothing is going to happen to you or Mom. We're going to expose this whole operation and make sure Jake and his accomplices can never hurt anyone else. There's something else, Dad continued. Jake has been forging legal documents, not just for us, but for other families too. I found templates on his computer for power of attorney papers, will modifications, even death certificates. This isn't just about stealing from us. It's about creating a systematic way to steal from elderly people and make their deaths look natural when they become inconvenient. Susan's phone rang and she answered it with visible tension. Agent Santos. Yes, we're at the hospital. You need to get here immediately. We have evidence of a much larger operation than we initially suspected. After hanging up, she turned to us with a grim expression. The FBI has been monitoring communications associated with Jake's known associates. There's been a significant increase in encrypted messaging traffic since your brother was detained. They believe the organization is implementing emergency protocols to eliminate potential witnesses. What does that mean? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. It means that everyone connected to Jake's operation, including your family, is now considered a liability to be eliminated. The FBI is arranging immediate protective custody, but we need to move quickly. Dad squeezed my hand tighter. Vicky, there's one more thing. I contacted you. What? About 4 months ago, when my head was clear enough to use the computer without Jake monitoring me, I sent you an email. I used an old account that I thought Jake didn't know about. I asked you to come home because I was starting to suspect that something was wrong. My mind raced backward through months of emails trying to remember anything that might have come from Dad. Then it hit me the message I'd received from an unfamiliar email address asking if I was okay and mentioning that the sender was worried about me. I'd assumed it was spam and deleted it without responding. Dad, I got that message, but I didn't realize it was from you. I thought it was some kind of scam. I was afraid you might. Jake had told us so many stories about you changing your identity using fake names that I wasn't sure how to reach you in a way that wouldn't seem suspicious. The irony was heartbreaking. While I'd been carefully monitoring their situation from a distance, Dad had been trying to reach out for help, and our communication had failed because we'd both been operating under false assumptions created by Jake's manipulations. Susan's phone buzzed with a text message. Agent Santos is in the building. She's coming up now, and she has additional agents with her. Mr. Morrison, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that you and your family will need to enter federal protection until this case is resolved. What about Mom? I asked. Is she safe at the house? Susan's expression darkened. No, she's not. We sent a unit to check on her 20 minutes ago. The house appears to be empty, and there are signs of a struggle in the bedroom where you found her earlier. My blood turned to ice. Are you saying that someone took my mother? We're saying that her current location is unknown and, given the circumstances we have, to assume she's in immediate danger. Agent Maria Santos chose that moment to enter the hospital room, followed by 2 other FBI agents and a man in tactical gear who looked like he'd stepped out of an action movie. Ms. Morrison. Agent Santos said without preamble, "We need to move your father to a secure location immediately, and then we need to find your mother before this criminal organization decides she's too dangerous to keep alive." As hospital security and FBI agents began coordinating Dad's transfer to protective custody, I realized that this nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Agent Santos briefed us in a secure conference room while Dad was being transferred to a safe house under federal protection. The full scope of the criminal organization was staggering: 43 confirmed victims across 12 states, over $15 million in stolen assets, and evidence suggesting that at least 8 elderly people had been murdered when they became inconvenient to the operation. The good news, Agent Santos explained, is that your brother's detention has created chaos in their communication network. They're making mistakes, sending unencrypted messages, exposing operational details they normally keep hidden. She pulled out a tablet displaying a series of intercepted text messages and phone call transcripts. The bad news is that they've accelerated their timeline for your family. According to these communications, they plan to eliminate all potential witnesses within the next 48 hours. Eliminate? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. Jake was supposed to arrange an accident that would kill both your parents and make their deaths appear natural. With him in custody and your father in protective custody, they're scrambling to salvage the operation. Agent Santos scrolled through the intercepted messages, highlighting key phrases. They're particularly concerned about your mother's potential testimony. According to these communications, she's been more alert, recently asking questions, remembering details about Jake's activities. Where do you think they've taken her? We're tracking several possibilities, but the most likely scenario is that they've moved her to a secondary location where they can stage her death to look like a medical emergency or accident. My hands were shaking as the full implications hit me. How do we find her? We use the same tactics they've been using against other families, Agent Santos replied with a grim smile. We set a trap. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would agree to meet with the organization's representatives ostensibly to negotiate my silence in exchange for my parents' safety. The meeting would be recorded, providing evidence of the criminal conspiracy while FBI agents tracked the location where they were holding Mom. The risk, Agent Santos warned, is that once they realize you're working with law enforcement, they may decide to eliminate your mother immediately rather than continue negotiations. And if I don't cooperate, they'll kill her anyway, along with anyone else who might pose a threat to their operation. The meeting was arranged for 6 p.m. at a restaurant in downtown Springfield, chosen because it was public enough to provide some safety, but private enough for sensitive conversations. I wore a wire and carried a GPS tracker with FBI agents positioned throughout the restaurant and in vehicles outside. Marcus Delacroix turned out to be a man in his 60s, well-dressed and soft-spoken, exactly the kind of person you'd trust with your financial planning or legal affairs. Diana Chen was younger, maybe 40, with the sharp intelligence of someone who'd built her career on exploiting other people's weaknesses. "Ms. Morrison," Marcus said after we'd ordered coffee, "I understand there have been some unfortunate misunderstandings regarding your family situation." Misunderstandings. I kept my voice level despite the rage building inside my chest. You mean the systematic poisoning of my elderly parents and the theft of their assets. I think there may be some confusion about the nature of the services we've been providing, Diana interjected smoothly. Your brother contacted our organization because he was concerned about your parents' declining mental health and their inability to manage their financial affairs. By drugging them with hallucinogens and antipsychotics? Marcus smiled sadly. Sometimes, families require difficult interventions to protect elderly members from making decisions that could harm themselves or their loved ones. The medications your parents received were designed to keep them calm and prevent them from becoming agitated or confused. And the forged suicide notes, the fake memorial service. Your brother was trying to protect your parents from the emotional trauma of believing their daughter had abandoned them, Diana explained. The story about your death allowed them to find closure and move forward with their lives. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable while describing monstrous crimes. These people had turned elder abuse into a business model, complete with psychological justifications for their actions. "Where is my mother?" I asked directly. "Your mother is safe," Marcus replied. "She's receiving appropriate medical care for her condition in a facility better equipped to handle her needs." "What facility?" "That information isn't relevant to our current discussion," Diana said. "What matters is finding a solution that protects everyone's interests going forward." "And what solution would that be?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You return to California and resume your business activities. We ensure that your parents receive excellent care for the remainder of their lives. No one investigates any alleged irregularities in their medical treatment or financial management. Everyone wins." "And if I refuse?" Diana's smile was cold and predatory. "Well, elderly people with dementia can be quite fragile. Accidents happen, medical emergencies occur without warning. It would be tragic if something unfortunate befell your mother while she was dealing with the stress of these family conflicts." The threat was clear and unambiguous. They were holding Mom hostage and would kill her if I didn't cooperate. But what they didn't know was that every word of our conversation was being recorded and transmitted to FBI agents positioned throughout the restaurant. More importantly, they'd made the crucial error of confirming that Mom was still alive and in their custody. "I need time to think about your offer," I said, standing up from the table. "Of course," Marcus replied, "but don't take too long. Your mother's health is quite delicate, and delays could have unfortunate consequences." As I walked toward the restaurant exit, my earpiece crackled with Agent Santos's voice. "Target acquired. We have a location on your mother. Moving to intercept." But before I could reach the door, Diana's phone rang, and I could see her face change as she answered the call. "We have a problem," she said to Marcus, her voice sharp with alarm. "Jake Morrison is talking to the FBI. He's confessing everything in exchange for a plea deal." Marcus stood abruptly, his friendly mask finally slipping to reveal the predator underneath. "Then, we need to implement the final protocol immediately." And that's when I realized that the trap had worked perfectly. The only question now was whether we'd spring it in time to save my mother's life. The FBI raid on the warehouse where Mom was being held lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours as I waited in Agent Santos's command vehicle, listening to tactical communications crackling through radio static. When her voice finally came through confirming, "Package secured, medical assistance required," I nearly collapsed with relief. Mom was conscious but heavily sedated when the ambulance brought her to Mercy General. Dr. Chen immediately began the same detoxification protocol that had helped Dad working to flush the dangerous cocktail of drugs from her system. The physical effects were concerning enough, but the psychological trauma of being kidnapped and held captive by people she'd trusted would take much longer to heal. "She keeps asking for you," the nurse told me as I sat beside her bed, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Even in her confused state, she knows you're here and it seems to comfort her." Dad arrived from the safe house 3 hours later, accompanied by federal marshals who determined that the immediate threat had passed with the arrest of Marcus, Diana, and 6 other members of their organization. The reunion between my parents was heartbreaking and beautiful, 2 people who'd been systematically isolated from each other rediscovering their connection. "I'm sorry," Dad whispered as he kissed Mom's forehead. "I'm so sorry I let them convince me you were losing your mind. I should have trusted my instincts about you about all of this." "We were both victims," Mom replied, her voice weak but growing stronger by the hour. "They were professionals at manipulating people, at making us doubt our own perceptions." Over the next week, as both my parents underwent medical treatment and psychological counseling, the full scope of what they'd endured became clear. Jake's operation had been systematically destroying their ability to think clearly, trust their memories, or maintain relationships with anyone outside his control. The isolation had been as damaging as the drugs, creating a prison of dependency that would have been nearly impossible to escape without outside intervention. But healing was possible, and I watched it happen day by day as my parents' minds cleared and their personalities re-emerged from the fog of chemical suppression. "I want to understand your business," Dad said one afternoon as we sat in Mom's hospital room looking at my laptop screen displaying Chen Tech Solutions company profile. "I want to understand what you built while we were lost." I walked them through my journey from sleeping in my car to building a multi-million-dollar company, from the lonely early days to the team of talented people who now worked with me to help small businesses thrive. But more importantly, I helped them understand that success hadn't changed who I was or diminished my love for them. "I never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other," I told them. "Every contract I sent to your construction company, every anonymous payment that helped keep you afloat, it was my way of staying connected, even when I couldn't be here physically." Mom cried when she realized how I'd been protecting them from a distance, even while believing they'd rejected me permanently. "You saved us," she said, "not just from Jake's operation, but from losing each other forever." Dr. Chen provided the medical confirmation we'd all been hoping for. The cognitive damage from the drugs was reversible. Both my parents would make full recoveries, regaining their mental clarity and emotional stability as the toxins cleared from their systems. "The brain is remarkably resilient," she explained. "The confusion and memory problems you experienced were chemically induced, not the result of permanent neurological damage. With proper treatment and time, you should both return to normal cognitive function." But perhaps the most healing moment came when Jake himself requested a meeting with our family. He looked different in his orange jumpsuit, smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of facing consequences for his actions. The federal charges against him were severe elder abuse fraud, conspiracy drug trafficking, and accessory to murder in the deaths of 3 elderly victims in other states. He was looking at a potential life sentence. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just need you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong." Dad leaned forward in his chair, his face a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Why, Jake? Help me understand how you could do this to people who loved you." "Gambling," Jake replied simply. "It started with sports, betting small amounts just for fun. But when I started losing, I told myself I could win it back with bigger bets. When those failed, I got involved with loan sharks, who made it clear that my debt would be paid one way or another." He looked directly at me for the first time since we'd entered the room. "When I heard about your success, about how much money your company was making, I felt like such a failure. The golden child who'd never amounted to anything while his sister became a millionaire. So you decided to eliminate me from the family." Marcus approached me. He said his organization helped families deal with difficult situations involving adult children who'd become problems. He made it sound like therapy, like intervention, like we'd be helping Mom and Dad adjust to your absence while I got my gambling debts handled. Jake's voice broke as he continued. "I didn't know about the murders at first. I thought we were just managing financial assets and providing medical care. But when I realized what we were really doing, I was in too deep to stop. They had evidence of my involvement leverage to destroy me if I tried to back out." Mom spoke for the first time since we'd entered the room. "Do you understand that you almost killed us?" "Yes," Jake whispered. "I understand that I'm a monster who destroyed his own family for money. I understand that I don't deserve forgiveness or second chances or anything, except whatever punishment the court decides I should receive." The psychological evaluation that was part of his plea negotiations revealed the depth of his self-loathing and genuine remorse. The therapist explained that Jake's actions had been driven by a combination of addiction, financial desperation, and psychological manipulation by more experienced criminals who'd exploited his vulnerabilities. That doesn't excuse what he did, Agent Santos explained to us after the meeting, but it does help us understand how these criminal organizations recruit accomplices and maintain control over them. Jake's cooperation with the FBI investigation led to the arrest of 17 additional members of the elder abuse network, including corrupt doctors, lawyers, and financial advisors who'd been facilitating the systematic exploitation of elderly victims across multiple states. Your family's case broke this operation wide open, Agent Santos told us. The evidence we gathered will help prosecute dozens of criminals and potentially save hundreds of elderly people from similar abuse. But for me, the most important outcome was watching my parents heal and rediscover their relationship with each other and with me. Dad threw himself into learning about my business, asking detailed questions about technology and entrepreneurship that reminded me why I'd always admired his curiosity and intelligence. Mom began volunteering with the hospital's elder abuse prevention program, sharing her story with other families and helping them recognize warning signs of manipulation and isolation. Something good has to come out of what we survived, she told me. Other families shouldn't have to go through what we went through. 6 months after the arrests, we held our first real Thanksgiving dinner in 3 years. Not just our family, but also Agent Santos and her team, Dr. Chen, and several of the hospital staff who'd helped expose the criminal operation, and Franklin, my private investigator, who'd provided the crucial evidence that started everything. I'm grateful, Dad said as he carved the turkey, for second chances for the truth and for a daughter who never gave up on us even when we gave up on ourselves. But the most meaningful moment came when he pulled me aside after dinner and handed me a small wrapped package. I found this in Jake's room when we were cleaning out his things, he said. I think it belongs to you. Inside was the acceptance letter to MIT graduate school that I'd received just before leaving home 3 years earlier. Jake had intercepted it, keeping it as some kind of trophy or reminder of the opportunities he'd helped destroy. I'm proud of you, Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. I should have told you that 3 years ago, and I should have trusted you to make your own decisions about your life. I'm proud of all of us, I replied. We survived something that was designed to destroy families, and we came through it stronger. As I looked around the dinner table at the faces of people who'd become extended family through our shared trauma and recovery, I realized that sometimes the worst experiences in life can lead to the most profound healing. Jake had tried to erase me from our family story. Instead, his actions had brought us closer together than we'd ever been before. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I sat in the conference room of Morrison Family Building with Dad, Mom, and Rebecca Martinez. My attorney spread sheets and business plans covering every inch of the table. Dad's construction company was technically still solvent, but barely weakened by years of Jake's sabotage and poor financial decisions. The good news, Rebecca explained, is that the contracts your shell company provided kept the business from total collapse. The bad news is that the damage to your reputation and client relationships will take time to repair. I'd been thinking about this moment for months, planning how I might help rebuild the family business if the opportunity ever arose. Now, with Jake's manipulation exposed and my parents' minds clear, we could finally have the conversation I dreamed of having 3 years earlier. Dad, what if we modernized everything? I suggested pulling up a presentation I'd prepared on my laptop. Not just the financial systems, but the entire business model. Construction companies that embrace technology are seeing 40% increases in efficiency and customer satisfaction. His eyes lit up with interest as I walked him through the possibilities. digital project management systems that would prevent the cost overruns and scheduling delays that had plagued recent projects, customer relationship management software that would help maintain better communication with clients, inventory management systems that would reduce waste and improve profit margins. But more than that, I continued, what if we specialized in something that matters, something that addresses a real need in our community? Mom leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. What kind of specialization? Accessible home modifications for elderly people who want to age in place safely, ramps, bathroom safety features, kitchen adaptations, smart home technology that can monitor health and safety remotely. The idea had been forming in my mind as I'd watched my parents recover from their ordeal. There were thousands of elderly people in our region who wanted to remain in their own homes but needed modifications to do so safely. It was a growing market with significant profit potential, but more importantly, it was work that would have genuine meaning. After what we've been through, I explained, I can't think of anything more important than helping families stay together safely. We could be the company that helps prevent other elderly people from becoming vulnerable to the kind of abuse our family experienced. Dad was quiet for a long moment, studying the financial projections and market analysis I'd prepared. How would this work practically? I know construction, but I don't know anything about technology or accessibility modifications. We'd train you. I'd hire specialists in both areas. My company has been developing smart home technology for elderly users, and I can adapt those systems for physical installation rather than just software implementation. I pulled up another screen showing prototype designs for integrated home modification systems. Imagine bathrooms with automatically adjusting grab bars, kitchens with voice-controlled appliances, medication management systems that alert family members if doses are missed. Mom's face was thoughtful as she examined the designs. This could help so many people, and it would give us a way to use what we learned from our experience to help others. Over the following weeks, we began the process of transforming Morrison Family Building from a struggling general construction company into a specialized leader in accessible home modifications. I invested $500,000 of my own money to upgrade equipment, hire additional staff, and develop training programs. But the real transformation happened when Dad began learning to use the technology systems I designed. The man who'd once dismissed my computer nonsense became fascinated with digital project management, spending hours learning how to optimize scheduling and resource allocation. I can see why you love this, he told me one evening as we worked late in the renovated office space. It's like solving puzzles, finding better ways to connect all the pieces. Mom threw herself into the customer service side of the business, developing relationships with local senior centers, healthcare providers, and social service organizations. Her experience as a victim of elder abuse gave her credibility with elderly clients who were naturally suspicious of contractors and service providers. When I tell them about what happened to us, she explained they understand that we really care about their safety and independence. Trust is everything in this business. The first major project was a complete home modification for the Patterson family, our next-door neighbors whose 85-year-old father had been struggling with mobility issues. We installed a residential elevator, renovated both bathrooms with accessible features, and integrated a smart home system that could monitor his vital signs and alert family members if he needed assistance. This is incredible, Mrs. Patterson told us at the project completion ceremony. For the first time in months, I'm not worried about Dad falling or having a medical emergency when no one's around to help. Word spread quickly through the community. Within 6 months, Morrison Family Building had a waiting list of clients and had hired 12 additional employees, including 2 registered nurses who specialize in home health care and 3 technology specialists who could install and maintain the smart home systems. Dad's company went from struggling to survive to being featured in Construction Today magazine as an innovative leader in accessible home modifications. Revenue increased by 300% in the first year, but more importantly, we were making a real difference in people's lives. I've learned something about success, Dad told me as we celebrated our 1-year anniversary. It's not just about making money or building things, it's about building things that matter to people who need them. The business success was gratifying, but the personal healing was even more meaningful. Working together every day, Dad and I developed the kind of relationship I'd always hoped we could have. He began to understand my love of technology and innovation, while I gained a deeper appreciation for his craftsmanship and attention to detail. "You know what the best part of this is," Mom said one evening as the three of us reviewed the day's client consultations. "We're helping families stay together. After almost losing each other, there's nothing more important than that." But the most rewarding moment came when we received a call from Dr. Chen at the hospital. She'd been tracking elderly abuse cases in our region and had noticed a significant decrease in incidents involving families who'd received home modifications from our company. "Your work is preventing the kind of isolation and vulnerability that criminal organizations exploit," she explained. "Elderly people who feel safe and independent in their homes are much less likely to become victims of manipulation or abuse." We were building more than accessible homes. We were building stronger, safer communities where elderly people could maintain their dignity and independence while staying connected to the families who love them. And in doing so, we'd found a way to transform our own family's trauma into something that protected and empowered other families facing similar challenges. The federal courthouse in Springfield was packed on the day of Jake's sentencing hearing. Media attention around the elder abuse case had been intense, with news outlets calling it the largest organized elder abuse prosecution in American history. I sat in the front row with my parents, Agent Santos and Susan Clark, watching as Jake's defense attorney made one final plea for leniency. "Your Honor," the attorney argued, "my client was himself a victim of manipulation by more sophisticated criminals who exploited his gambling addiction and financial desperation. He has cooperated fully with federal investigators, providing testimony that led to the conviction of 17 other defendants." Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the case files spread before her, taking her time to consider the complex circumstances surrounding Jake's crimes. The prosecution had recommended a sentence of 20 to 25 years, while the defense had asked for 10 to 15 years with credit for cooperation and time served. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Williams said, looking directly at my brother, "you have pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including elder abuse, conspiracy fraud, and drug trafficking. The evidence shows that your actions contributed to the deaths of 3 elderly victims in other states and caused severe psychological and physical harm to your own parents." Jake stood slowly, his orange jumpsuit making him look smaller and more vulnerable than the confident man who'd once dismissed my dreams as foolish fantasies. "I understand the gravity of my crimes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but filled with genuine remorse. "I know that my cooperation with law enforcement doesn't erase the harm I caused or justify the choices I made. I just hope that some good can come from exposing this criminal organization and preventing other families from experiencing what mine went through." Judge Williams nodded, then turned to address our family. "Before I pronounce sentence, I'd like to hear from the victims. Mrs. Morrison, would you like to make a statement?" Mom stood on unsteady legs, but her voice was clear and strong as she spoke. "My son nearly killed my husband and me, not just physically, but psychologically. He convinced us that our daughter was dead, that we were losing our minds, that we couldn't trust our own memories or perceptions. The isolation and confusion were sometimes worse than the physical effects of the drugs he gave us." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "But I also know that Jake was manipulated by people who were much more experienced at exploiting vulnerable individuals. The psychological evaluation shows that he genuinely feels remorse for his actions and understands the harm he caused. What would you like to see happen to your son? I'd like to see him get the help he needs to understand why he made these choices, and I'd like to see him use his remaining years to make amends by helping prevent other families from going through what we experienced. Dad spoke next, his statement focusing on the systemic nature of elder abuse and the need for stronger protections for vulnerable elderly people. This wasn't just about one family or one criminal, he said. This was about an organized operation that targeted dozens of elderly victims across multiple states. My son's sentence should reflect not just his individual crimes, but his role in a larger criminal enterprise that destroyed lives and families. When my turn came, I found myself speaking not just about the personal impact of Jake's actions, but about the broader implications for elder abuse prevention and victim protection. Your Honor, my brother's crimes nearly destroyed our family, but they also exposed a criminal network that was systematically abusing elderly people across the country. The investigation that resulted from our case has led to new federal legislation, improved training for healthcare providers, and better protection systems for vulnerable elderly individuals. I looked directly at Jake as I continued. I believe my brother is genuinely remorseful, and I hope he'll use his time in prison to contribute to elder abuse prevention efforts. But I also believe that the sentence should reflect the seriousness of crimes that specifically target our most vulnerable citizens. Judge Williams took a 30-minute recess to consider the statements and review the sentencing guidelines one final time. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Mr. Morrison, she began, your crimes represent a particularly egregious form of abuse because they targeted elderly victims who trusted you and relied on you for care and protection. The systematic nature of your actions, combined with your participation in a broader criminal enterprise, requires a significant punishment. However, your cooperation with law enforcement has been substantial and genuinely helpful in dismantling this criminal organization. Your expressions of remorse appear to be sincere, and the psychological evaluation suggests genuine insight into the harm you caused. Jake's hands were shaking as he waited for the final decision. I hereby sentence you to 18 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after serving 12 years. This sentence will be served concurrently with any state charges that may be filed. Additionally, you will be required to pay full restitution to all victims identified in this case, including your parents. The sentence was longer than Jake's attorney had hoped for, but shorter than the maximum the prosecution had sought. More importantly, it included provisions for Jake to participate in victim advocacy programs during his incarceration, allowing him to contribute to elder abuse prevention efforts while serving his time. After the sentencing, Agent Santos gathered our family for a final debriefing. The investigation sparked by your case has resulted in the prosecution of 43 individuals across 12 states, she reported. We've recovered over $8 million in stolen assets and identified another 67 elderly victims who were targeted by this organization. More importantly, she continued, Congress has passed new legislation strengthening penalties for elder abuse and requiring better coordination between state and federal agencies investigating these crimes. Your family's courage in coming forward has literally changed the legal landscape for protecting elderly Americans. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was a letter we received from Jake 6 months after his sentencing. He'd been accepted into a prison education program focused on victim advocacy and elder abuse prevention, and was working with federal authorities to develop training materials for law enforcement agencies investigating similar crimes. I know I can never undo the harm I caused, he wrote, but I'm committed to spending the rest of my life working to prevent other families from experiencing what ours went through. The other inmates in this program and I are developing a curriculum that will help police officers and social workers recognize the early warning signs of organized elder abuse. The letter continued with specific details about the advocacy work he was doing and his plans for continuing victim services after his eventual release. I don't expect forgiveness, he concluded, but I want you to know that something positive is emerging from the consequences of my actions. Other elderly people will be safer because of what we learned from this case. As I folded the letter and put it away, I reflected on how justice sometimes works in unexpected ways. Jake's punishment was serving not just as consequences for his crimes, but as preparation for a lifetime of making amends through service to the very community he'd harmed. The legal victory was important, but the personal healing it represented was even more significant. The phone call from Governor Patricia Thompson's office came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing blueprints for our latest accessible home modification project. Her chief of staff explained that the governor was forming a bipartisan commission on elder abuse prevention and wanted me to serve as a technology and business representative. The legislation that resulted from your family's case was just the beginning, Chief of Staff Michael Rodriguez explained. Governor Thompson wants to create comprehensive systemic changes that will protect elderly Californians from the kind of organized abuse your family experienced. The appointment was both an honor and a responsibility that I felt deeply. Our family's ordeal had exposed weaknesses in state oversight systems, gaps in healthcare monitoring, and inadequate coordination between law enforcement agencies. Now I had the opportunity to help design solutions that would protect thousands of vulnerable elderly people. The Commission's first meeting brought together an impressive array of experts, healthcare administrators, law enforcement officials, social workers, victim advocacy specialists, and family members who'd survived elder abuse situations similar to ours. But I quickly realized that my perspective as both a victim and a technology entrepreneur provided unique insights into prevention strategies. But traditional approaches to elder abuse prevention have focused primarily on investigating crimes after they've already occurred. I explained during my first presentation to the Commission. What we need are proactive systems that can identify patterns of abuse before they escalate to the point where victims require rescue. I outlined a comprehensive monitoring system that would integrate healthcare records, financial transaction monitoring, and social service check-ins to create early warning indicators when elderly individuals were becoming isolated or showing signs of manipulation. The technology exists right now. I continued to flag unusual patterns in prescription drug usage, sudden changes in financial activity, or decreased social contact that might indicate systematic abuse. The challenge is creating legal frameworks that protect privacy while enabling intervention. Commissioner Sarah Martinez, a retired social worker, raised an important concern. How do we balance protection with elderly people's autonomy? Many seniors are rightfully concerned about technology systems that monitor their private activities. That's exactly why the systems need to be designed with elderly users as partners rather than subjects, I replied. My company has been developing opt-in monitoring systems that elderly people control themselves, sharing information with trusted family members or healthcare providers only when they choose to do so. Over the following months, I worked with the Commission to develop legislation that would create the first statewide elder abuse prevention network in the United States. The system would provide funding for technology implementation training for healthcare providers and social workers and coordination mechanisms between agencies that had previously operated independently. But the work wasn't limited to government policy. The publicity around our family's case had generated national media attention, and I began receiving speaking invitations from conferences, universities, and professional organizations across the country. My first major presentation was at the National Healthcare Administration Conference in Washington, D.C. where I spoke to over 3,000 hospital administrators, doctors, and healthcare policy experts about recognizing and preventing organized elder abuse. Healthcare providers are often the first professionals to observe signs of systematic elder abuse. I explained to the audience, elderly patients who suddenly develop multiple unexplained medical conditions, who seem confused about their medications, or who appear fearful of family members, may be victims of the kind of organized abuse that nearly killed my parents. I walked them through the specific signs that healthcare providers had missed in my parents' case, the warning indicators that might have triggered earlier intervention, and the systemic changes that could prevent similar situations in the future. The doctors treating my parents weren't negligent or incompetent, I emphasized. They were simply operating within a system that wasn't designed to recognize sophisticated criminal manipulation disguised as family caregiving. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks of my presentation, 17 hospitals across the country had implemented new screening protocols for elderly patients, and 3 medical schools had added elder abuse recognition to their required curriculum. But perhaps the most meaningful impact came from the families who contacted me directly after hearing our story. Maria Gonzalez from Texas called to tell me that my presentation had helped her recognize that her elderly father was being manipulated by a caregiver who was systematically stealing his assets. I saw the pattern you described, she explained. Dad was becoming more confused, more isolated from family, more dependent on this one person who claimed to be helping him. Your presentation gave me the courage to investigate further and contact authorities before the situation escalated. Robert Chen from Oregon reached out after recognizing that his elderly mother's supposed dementia diagnosis might actually be chemically induced manipulation by a family member. The timeline of her cognitive decline exactly matched what you described, he said. We had her tested for the same substances that were used on your parents, and sure enough, she was being systematically drugged. We were able to intervene before she lost her home or her life. Stories like these started arriving weekly, then daily, as awareness of organized elder abuse spread through medical conferences, law enforcement training programs, and family support networks. Agent Santos estimated that our advocacy work was directly contributing to the prevention of dozens of elder abuse cases every month. The Commission's recommendations became law in California 18 months after our family's ordeal began. The Elder Protection Act established the first comprehensive monitoring and prevention system for elderly abuse in the United States, serving as a model that other states began adopting. This legislation will save lives, Governor Thompson said at the signing ceremony, with our family standing beside her. But more than that, it will help preserve the dignity and independence that elderly Americans deserve. The law included funding for technology implementation, mandatory training for healthcare providers and social workers, and creation of rapid response teams that could investigate suspected elder abuse within 24 hours of receiving reports. But the provision I was most proud of was the victim advocacy component that drew directly from Jake's prison education work. The law required that victim advocates with personal experience of elder abuse be involved in training law enforcement officers and healthcare providers. People who've survived these situations understand the psychological dynamics in ways that textbooks can't teach. I explained to legislators during the final committee hearing. Their perspectives are crucial for developing effective prevention and intervention strategies. 6 months after the law took effect, California reported a 60% increase in early identification of elder abuse cases and a 40% decrease in the severity of abuse incidents when they were discovered. Other states began implementing similar systems, and the federal government started developing national standards based on the California model. I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on aging, sharing our family's story with federal legislators who were crafting national elder protection legislation. Elder abuse is not just a family problem or a local problem, I told the subcommittee. It's a national crisis that requires coordinated federal response. The criminal organization that targeted my family operated across 12 states, and they were only stopped by federal investigation and prosecution. The congressional testimony led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting work with other states that were developing their own elder protection systems. My business background proved valuable in helping government agencies understand how to implement technology solutions efficiently and cost effectively. But the most rewarding aspect of the advocacy work was the direct feedback from families who'd been helped by the systems we designed. Helen Rodriguez from Arizona wrote to tell me that the early warning monitoring system had detected that her elderly grandfather was being systematically isolated and financially exploited by a caregiver. The system flagged unusual financial transactions and social isolation patterns, she explained. Adult Protective Services contacted our family before we even realized there was a problem. We were able to intervene before grandfather lost his savings or his health. These success stories reinforced my belief that our family's trauma could be transformed into protection for thousands of other elderly Americans. The work was emotionally demanding, requiring me to revisit our own experience repeatedly while helping other families navigate similar crises. But it was also deeply fulfilling knowing that every family we helped meant fewer elderly people suffering the kind of systematic abuse that had nearly destroyed my parents. You've taken something terrible and turned it into something powerful, Mom told me after attending one of my conference presentations. I'm proud of how you've used our experience to help other families stay safe and stay together. The commission work legislation and national advocacy represented more than professional achievement. They represented the transformation of our family's greatest trauma into our most meaningful contribution to society. And they proved that sometimes the worst experiences in life can become the foundation for the most important work you'll ever do. 1 year later, our Thanksgiving dinner looked nothing like the quiet family gatherings of my childhood. The dining room table had been expanded with 2 additional tables to accommodate 37 guests, including FBI agents, hospital staff commission members, other elder abuse survivors, and neighbors who'd become extended family through our shared experiences. Dad stood at the head of the table looking healthier and more confident than I'd seen him in years, preparing to carve not 1 but 3 turkeys to feed our massive gathering. This year, he said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room, we have more to be thankful for than any family should reasonably expect. We have our health, our safety, our business, and most importantly, we have each other. He gestured toward the diverse group of people filling our home. But we also have something else that's precious beyond measure. We have proof that people can survive terrible things and choose to use their survival to help others. Agent Santos raised her glass of sparkling cider. To the Morrison family who turned their worst experience into other families' safety net. Dr. Chen added her own toast. To patients who became advocates, victims who became protectors, and a family who chose healing over hatred. The toasts continued around the table, each guest sharing something they were grateful for and how our family's experience had touched their own lives. Susan Clark, the social worker who'd been our first ally, spoke about the 17 families she'd helped in the past year using intervention techniques we'd developed together. Franklin, my private investigator, described how the case had changed his approach to elder abuse investigations and led to his specialization in protecting vulnerable elderly clients. Rebecca Martinez, my attorney, talked about the pro bono legal clinic she'd established to help elder abuse victims navigate the complex process of recovering their assets and rebuilding their lives. But the most meaningful toast came from an unexpected source. Margaret Patterson, an 82-year-old woman from Sacramento, had driven 3 hours to join our celebration. She'd been rescued from an elder abuse situation similar to ours after her granddaughter heard my congressional testimony and recognized the warning signs. 6 months ago, I was a prisoner in my own home. She said, her voice clear and strong despite her age. My nephew had convinced everyone that I was losing my mind, that I needed constant supervision and medication to keep me calm. I believed it myself. She looked directly at my parents as she continued, but this family's courage to speak publicly about their experience gave my granddaughter the knowledge she needed to save my life. I'm here tonight because they refused to let their trauma be meaningless. Margaret pulled out a folded piece of paper from her purse. I wrote something I wanted to share with all of you. Dear Morrison family. She read, "You saved me without ever meeting me. You turned your pain into my freedom, your healing into my hope. Because you were brave enough to tell your story, I got my life back. Because you chose to fight for other families, my granddaughter knew how to fight for me. I can never repay that gift, but I can promise to spend my remaining years helping other elderly people recognize manipulation and ask for help when they need it." There wasn't a dry eye in the room as Margaret finished reading her letter. But the surprises weren't over. A knock at the front door interrupted the emotional moment, and I opened it to find a young man in his 20s holding an enormous bouquet of flowers and wearing a nervous smile. "Is this the Morrison house?" he asked. "I'm David Peterson, and I think I have something that belongs to you." He handed me an envelope addressed to our family in familiar handwriting. It was from Jake. I'm David Peterson from the Federal Prison Education Program," the young man explained. "Your brother asked me to deliver this personally because he wanted to make sure you knew how serious he is about the work he's doing." Inside the envelope was a 3-page letter in Jake's handwriting, along with a certificate showing his completion of a victim advocacy training program and a preliminary outline for a book he was writing about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. "Dear Mom, Dad, and Vicky," the letter began. "I know that no amount of work I do in prison can undo the harm I caused our family, but I want you to know that every day I wake up thinking about how to prevent other families from going through what we did." The letter described in detail the advocacy work he'd been doing with federal authorities, his collaboration with other prisoners who were working on victim services projects, and his plans for continuing elder abuse prevention work after his eventual release. "The warden has approved my proposal to create a comprehensive training manual for law enforcement officers investigating elder abuse cases," he wrote. "The manual will include real case studies, warning signs that officers should watch for, and intervention strategies that can save lives." But the most moving part of the letter was his personal reflection on our family's healing. "David tells me that you've invited families affected by elder abuse to share Thanksgiving dinner with you. That doesn't surprise me, because even when I was hurting you, you were thinking about how to help others. I hope someday I can contribute to that healing in person, but for now I'm doing everything I can to make sure other families don't need rescuing the way ours did." The letter concluded with specific details about legislation he was helping to draft from prison testimony he'd provided to congressional investigators and his collaboration with universities that were developing elder abuse prevention curricula. "Please tell everyone at your dinner that there are people working every day to make sure elderly Americans are safer because of what our family survived. Some of those people are in prison, some are in hospitals, some are in government, and some are sitting around your table tonight. All of us are connected by the belief that elderly people deserve dignity, safety, and family love." David Peterson stayed for dinner, sharing stories about the victim advocacy work being done by prisoners across the federal system and the impact it was having on crime prevention and victim services. "Your brother has become one of the most effective advocates in our program," David explained. "He's helped train over 200 law enforcement officers, and his manual on elder abuse recognition is being adopted by police departments across the country. As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I reflected on how completely our family's story had been transformed. What had begun as rejection, manipulation, and near tragedy had become advocacy, healing, and community building. Mom found me in the kitchen as I was putting away leftover food, her face glowing with contentment and purpose. "You know what I realized tonight?" she said, drying dishes with the methodical precision that had always been her trademark. "This is what family is supposed to look like. Not just blood relatives sitting around a table, but people who care about each other and work together to make the world better." Dad joined us, carrying the last of the serving dishes from the dining room. "I've been thinking about what Jake wrote in his letter," he said, "about all of us being connected by the belief that elderly people deserve dignity and safety. I think he's right about that." "And I think he's right about something else too," I added. "The work we're doing isn't just about preventing elder abuse. It's about building communities where people take care of each other, where families stay connected, where nobody has to face crisis alone." As we finished cleaning up the kitchen, I looked around at our home, filled with evidence of the evening's celebration, photos from the dinner, contact information from new friends, and planning notes for future advocacy projects. Our house had become a gathering place for people working to prevent the kind of trauma our family had survived. Our story had become a blueprint for healing that other families could follow. Our worst experience had become our most meaningful contribution. "Next year," Mom said as we turned off the kitchen lights, "we'll need even more tables." She was right. The community we'd built around our shared commitment to protecting vulnerable elderly people was growing every month, and our Thanksgiving celebration was becoming an annual tradition that brought together advocates, survivors, professionals, and family members from across the country. But more than that, it was becoming proof that love really is stronger than manipulation, that truth really can overcome deception, and that families really can heal from even the most devastating betrayals. As I headed upstairs to bed, I felt grateful, not just for our survival, but for the opportunity to transform our trauma into protection for others. Tomorrow, we'd get back to work, building accessible homes, developing technology systems, advocating for policy changes, and helping other families navigate their own crises. But tonight, we celebrated the truth that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do with our lives. 5 years have passed since that cold Thanksgiving morning when I stood on my family's doorstep and heard my father deny my existence. As I sit in my office this evening, looking out at the city lights of Springfield, I can hardly believe how completely our lives have been transformed. The framed photograph on my desk shows last month's graduation ceremony at the federal prison, where Jake completed his bachelor's degree in social work, specializing in elder abuse prevention. He won't be eligible for parole for another 7 years, but he's already made contributions to victim protection that will outlast his sentence by decades. His training manual has been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 43 states. His testimony led to federal legislation that created the first national database for tracking elder abuse patterns. His collaboration with universities has resulted in elder abuse prevention being included in the curriculum for social workers, healthcare providers, and law enforcement officers across the country. "Redemption isn't about erasing the past," he wrote in his most recent letter. "It's about making sure the future is different because of what you learned from your mistakes." Mom's rosebush, the one Jake had planted in my supposed memory, bloomed more beautifully this year than ever before. We decided to keep it, but we added a plaque that reads, "In honor of families reunited and love that survives deception." It serves as a reminder of how close we came to losing each other forever and how grateful we are for every day we have together. Dad's construction company has become the largest accessible home modification business in the state, with a waiting list that stretches 6 months and a reputation for transforming houses into safe havens for elderly people who want to age in place with dignity. We've modified over 2,000 homes, and follow-up studies show that our clients are 60% less likely to become victims of elder abuse than elderly people in traditional housing situations. Building homes that keep families together, Dad always tells new employees, is the most important construction work anyone can do. The technology platform I developed to support our construction business has been licensed to companies in 37 states, creating a network of accessible home modification specialists who share resources, training, and best practices. What started as a way to help my parents has grown into a national movement to protect elderly Americans through better housing design and family connection systems. But the most meaningful part of our story isn't the business success or the policy changes or even the prevention of future elder abuse cases, though all of those matter deeply. The most meaningful part is what we learned about the nature of family forgiveness and the incredible human capacity for healing. I used to believe that families were defined by blood relationships and shared history. I thought that love was something you either had or didn't have, that trust was something that couldn't be repaired once it was broken, that betrayal would inevitably destroy the bonds between people who were supposed to care for each other. Our experience taught me that none of those assumptions were true. Real family bonds aren't created by genetics or legal relationships. They're created by people who choose to stand by each other through crisis, who work together to solve problems, who prioritize each other's well-being, even when it's difficult or costly. The people who gathered around our Thanksgiving table last month included FBI agents who could have treated us as just another case file, but instead became advocates for our healing. Healthcare providers who could have seen us as patients, but instead became partners in our recovery. Neighbors who could have seen our crisis as entertainment, but instead became supporters of our advocacy work. And perhaps most surprisingly, Jake's imprisonment led not to the destruction of our family relationships, but to their deepest healing. Separated by concrete walls and federal restrictions, we were forced to communicate through letters to rebuild trust, through consistent actions over time to choose forgiveness as a deliberate practice rather than an emotional response. I understand now, Jake wrote after 3 years of victim advocacy work, that I didn't just hurt our family, I hurt the idea of family for everyone who heard our story. People lost faith in the possibility that families could survive betrayal, that brothers could protect sisters, that sons could honor parents. Part of my work now is helping people believe in family again. His insight was profound and accurate. The emails I receive from families dealing with elder abuse often include expressions of hopelessness, beliefs that family relationships are inherently fragile and that betrayal is inevitable when money or power is involved. Our story has become proof that those beliefs are false. Families can survive manipulation, deception, and even systematic abuse. Trust can be rebuilt through consistent actions and genuine accountability. Love really is stronger than fear. Truth really is more powerful than lies, and healing really is possible even after the most devastating betrayals. But none of this happens automatically or easily. Healing requires people who are willing to do the hard work of facing truth, accepting responsibility, and choosing love even when other emotions feel more satisfying. It requires systems and communities that support victims while holding abusers accountable. It requires the belief that people can change, and that relationships can be rebuilt on stronger foundations than they had originally. Most importantly, healing requires the recognition that our worst experiences don't define us unless we allow them to. We can choose to let trauma make us bitter, suspicious, and isolated. Or we can choose to let it make us compassionate, wise, and committed to protecting others from similar harm. The choice between those two responses determines whether our suffering becomes meaningless or becomes the foundation for meaningful contribution to the world. I chose to transform our family's trauma into other families' protection. Mom chose to transform her experience as a victim into service as an advocate. Dad chose to transform his business from general construction into specialized work that keeps elderly people safe and independent. Even Jake from his prison cell chose to transform his crimes into contributions to victim protection and crime prevention. None of us could undo the past or erase the harm that was caused, but all of us could choose how to respond to that harm in ways that created meaning and purpose from suffering. The most important decision you'll ever make, Mom told the audience at her last speaking engagement, isn't what career to pursue or where to live or who to marry. It's whether to let the worst things that happen to you make you worse or make you better. As I prepare to close my laptop and head home for dinner with my parents, I'm reflecting on the question I want to leave you with. Think about the most difficult experience you've survived, the betrayal that hurt you most deeply, the loss that seemed too devastating to overcome. Now ask yourself, how could that experience become the foundation for helping others avoid similar harm? How could your survival become someone else's salvation? How could your healing become a model for other people's recovery? If our family could survive systematic deception, elder abuse, and criminal manipulation to become stronger and more connected than we'd ever been before, what's possible for your family? What relationships could be healed with enough patience and commitment? What communities could be built around shared experiences of survival and recovery? The answers to those questions aren't just personal. They're about the kind of society we create together, the kind of support we offer to vulnerable people, the kind of future we build for our own aging and the aging of people we love. Elder abuse affects millions of American families every year, but it's preventable when communities are educated, systems are coordinated, and families stay connected across generations. Technology can help, legislation can help, law enforcement can help. But ultimately, protection comes from people who care about each other and refuse to let vulnerable members of their community suffer in isolation. If this story has resonated with you, I hope you'll take action to protect the elderly people in your own community. Check on elderly neighbors, especially those who seem isolated or whose adult children control their access to friends and family. Learn the warning signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Support organizations that provide services to elderly people who want to age safely in their homes. Most importantly, remember that family relationships require active maintenance, honest communication, and the willingness to address problems before they become crises. Don't wait for tragedy to remind you that the people you love need to know they're loved. Don't assume that silence means everything is okay. Don't let pride or stubbornness prevent you from reaching out when relationships become strained. The phone call you make today to check on an elderly parent or relative could be the intervention that saves their life. The conversation you have with an aging family member about their safety and independence could be the prevention that protects them from exploitation. The support you offer to a neighbor dealing with family crisis could be the difference between their family's destruction and their family's healing. Our story began with rejection and betrayal, but it ended with love, justice, and the knowledge that no family is too broken to heal if people are willing to do the work of rebuilding trust and choosing forgiveness. What story will your family write together? Thank you for listening to our journey. If this story moved you, please like this video to help more people discover resources for elder abuse prevention. Subscribe to stay updated on family safety topics and share this with anyone who might benefit from knowing that healing is always possible. Comment below with your own thoughts about family forgiveness or elder abuse prevention. Together, we can build communities where elderly people are safe, families stay connected, and everyone has the support they need to age with dignity. Remember, you have more power than you realize to protect vulnerable people in your community and to heal relationships that matter to you. Use that power wisely and use it soon. The people you love are counting on it.